Hello and welcome to the Carneades Q&A 40,000 subscriber live stream. If anyone's out there in the comments listening, watching, please give me a heads up if you can hear me or if the audio is too loud or too quiet. But otherwise, let me start outlining what is going to happen in this. So basically, I'm going to talk for a little bit beginning just about some ground rules for how we're going to do this, and then I'll be taking questions in the chat. Anyone that wants to ask a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll do my best to get to all the questions throughout the time, and then if there's a bunch of questions that I don't get to, I'll try to reply to them in comments later. So, does anyone hear me? Or... Alright, well, we're going to keep going, and hopefully people hear me, and hopefully people comment and complain that they don't hear me. Otherwise, you'll just be treated to an interesting video that has no sound. So, just to kick things off, generally in these things, this is the second live Q&A that we've done. I don't answer questions about my personal life or anything outside of kind of the channel or philosophy. The reason that I do that is because I do a lot of work in international development. I work in countries where it is illegal and punishable very seriously to be things like non-religious or a skeptic. And that means that if this channel was connected to the work that I do out in the world, it could get both the organizations that I work for in trouble, as well as me personally in trouble. So I'm not going to be answering questions about specifically who I am or anything personal, but I'm here to answer questions about philosophy. So, here we have it. So, as you see, today we're going to be looking at the creation of the face of Karl Marx, who arguably may be a philosopher, might just be an economist or a political theorist, depending on what you think of him, but either way, he's got a cool face, and we're going to be making it. So, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat right now. I'm not seeing anyone come up in the chat, but that may be an issue on my end. But if not, I'll ramble on until someone says something. Alright, so things that I've been thinking about lately. I've been reading some of Susan Oken and her work on multiculturalism and feminism, and the argument basically that there's some kind of tension or an issue between multiculturalism and feminism. For anyone that's just joining, feel free to throw questions in the chat anytime you have them, and I'll get around to answering them. I'm just rambling on until someone asks a question. Okay, so... Susan Oken and multiculturalism and feminism. So Oken argues that basically there are these two great goals of kind of the liberal establishment, that we care about feminism, but we also care about multiculturalism. We care about people being able to hold on to their cultures and traditions, but that's deeply in tension with some of the ideas of feminism, that in fact if we let people hold on to their cultures and traditions, that would lead to a lot of women being disenfranchised, because a lot of cultures going back in time are pretty oppressive to women or have a lot of issues. Also, maybe I'm not getting comments because no one can hear me, or maybe I'm just using this wrong. I don't see any comments in the chat right now, but... Huh. Interesting. Well, this may be just our... Oh, here we are. Wonderful. Apologies. I was failing at using technology. Clearly an evil deceiver deceived me. I see some lovely things. Okay, so I'll start at the top of these comments and see if I can get back to them. So, please define theology. Ooh, that's a tough one. Theology is, I would say, a separate discipline from philosophy. Frequently it overlaps with philosophy in that it's trying to do a lot of the same things, but from a very strongly dogmatic point. But it mixes a little bit with history and those kinds of things. I don't work much in theology. I work in philosophy, which is a world that tries to kind of bring some of theology, but bring it in conversation with other academic disciplines, as well as pretty much anything else in just the world of argument. So I am not an expert and couldn't perfectly define it, but I would say that frequently it's doing a lot of things that philosophy of religion does, from a different perspective. So, okay, as a radical skeptic, do you think Descartes doesn't even know that he thinks and is? Okay, so I have a series of videos on this, where I talk about kind of doubting Descartes and doubting the cogito. So, basically, I'll give you a quick summary of the argument. So, Descartes says things like, I'm sure that I'm thinking, because if I'm in the process of doubting, then that is thinking, and so by doubting myself, I must be thinking. I couldn't doubt that I'm thinking, because in doing so I would be thinking. So the argument one can bring against that is something along the lines of, imagine consistently you have some experience X, and every time you have that experience X, you associate that with pain. You have the experience, you associate it with pain, experience pain, over and over and over again. And then one time, you have that experience X, but you think, ooh, I just got tickled. There's something that we want to say is wrong or incorrect about what you just said, or the belief that you just had about your own experience. Always you've associated experience X with being in pain. But then one day, just by chance, you associate having experience X with being tickled. We want to say that that might be incorrect. So now replace pain with thinking. So let's say that over and over again you have a particular experience that you think is doubting. And you associate that with doubting. But then one day you get to the point where you have that experience of doubting, but you associate it with tickle. Or you associate it with pain, or you associate it with some other experience. The issue there is that basically you're making some mistake about your own mental states. So that's how we can doubt that you're thinking. Now, how could you doubt that you even exist? For me, this a little bit gets into issues of personal identity. How can you really know that you exist over time? Well, I'm concerned that people can exist over time at all, and that there's some issues with theories of personal identity. I'm not going to get into all of them right now, because I see a lot of comments have built up. Favorite contemporary philosopher and why? So, I don't know. I would say it depends on what I'm thinking about. I really love Saul Kripke because I love logic and I love going back to that. So I really appreciate Kripke's work. I've done a number of videos on some of his stuff. But he's very much for the kind of logically and philosophical language or philosophy of language minded folks out there. So that might be a little rough on everyone else. I've been interested in, not because I necessarily agree with all of his positions, but because I think he takes some interesting positions. David Benatar, I believe, he may be an African philosopher. I think he's a South African philosopher, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm a skeptic. And so that also makes me interested in some of his works. I'd suggest you check him out. Antinatalism has been in the news lately, so I'm sure Benatar's getting a lot of calls. Have I ever taught a philosophy class at a school or a university, and do I have any experience? Do you have any tips for a classroom teacher? So I don't talk about my personal experience. One of my ideas on the channel is that philosophy is important for anyone to be able to do and should be done, and it should be separate from this kind of academic institution that we've put it in, and people should have access to philosophy separate from that. So I don't go into my own background in philosophy, particularly because I don't want people to be convinced by my arguments because they think I have a degree after my name, and they should be convinced by my arguments on their merits. And I don't think anyone else should use that, oh, I have a PhD in philosophy, therefore you should believe me. I think that's a crutch, and I think that destroys the foundation of what philosophy is about. So in terms of tips, I teach philosophy, at least on YouTube. Tips for a classroom teacher. I think teaching is a difficult job, no matter what you do, and I don't think that there is any one solution from kind of an education policy standpoint. I don't think there's any one solution that works for any classroom and any place and any class you're teaching. So any advice I would have would be specific to a situation. So I am sure that's unhelpful. But my thought would be that in terms of philosophy of education and policy, I think that every classroom looks different, every group of students looks different, and it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to pick a single idea out that's the right one. Yes, I couldn't see the chat, and I finally figured out how to do it, so good. Someone's thinking of dropping out of physics and focusing on philosophy. I know folks that have done both physics and a philosophy on both sides. I think that they can complement each other really well. I think one of the great things about philosophy is that you can continue working on it, or you can work within the world of philosophy without necessarily constantly taking classes or doing that kind of thing. I don't need a big lab to continue to do philosophy. You just need access to books, really, and access to the works of other people. So, and physics can be a much more lucrative profession than philosophy. So I don't know. I think it's what you care about and it's what you want to learn about. I think that really looking at both can be fascinating. I think that philosophy has a lot to teach physics, and I think I frequently wish there were more people that were working in physics that had a background in philosophy. So, or really in any field, but that's probably a separate thing. Thoughts on the moral argument? When you say the moral argument, and I know this is old comments, the moral argument, which one are you talking about? As in the moral argument, perhaps, that God exists. So that's something along the lines of, I would say, a Kantian transcendental argument that might say, oh, morality exists, the only way we could have morality is because God exists, therefore God exists. So that's going to be one of those things, like the other transcendental arguments, where there's an issue between moving from individual mental states to statements about the world and ontology. So that would be my thoughts on that. I am going to do a series on transcendental arguments one of these days. Right now, my philosophy of religion series are a little bottlenecked up behind Thomas Aquinas, which I do want to get through before I start some other ones. But that would be my thoughts on it. Check out my video on Kant's transcendental arguments for more generally on those types of arguments. May we see your face, because you want to know the person behind these amusing contents. Unfortunately, like I said at the beginning when I kicked off the stream, because I work in a lot of developing countries, some of which are actively hostile to atheists or skeptics, I don't associate my identity out in the real world with this channel. So that means you can't see my face to be making amusing faces or strange gestures when I'm doing things, but hopefully you'll be at least somewhat amused by Marx's face getting built here. Is this a hint about video about Marx in the future? Super excited if it is. I do not have planned a specific video about Marx in the future. But there's so many things that I want to do. There's so many different videos I want to make. A video on Marx and the philosophies of Marx would be great. At some point, getting into philosophies of economics and political philosophies is a direction I want to go on the channel, or at least add into on the channel. But there's so many different things I want to do, I never have time to do any of them. thoughts about progressivism and the abandonment of religion. So I'm a skeptic, so I am worried when people hold any dogma, and religion is a classic case of a dogma. And when I say dogma as a skeptic, I really am talking about any belief. Like, thinking that you exist is a dogma in my book. So, progressivism and the abandonment of religion. I think economists might say there's a correlation between countries becoming more progressive and abandoning religion. I think there might be a lot of factors that we might associate with that, but I'm a skeptic as exactly the reasons to that. Some people might say, oh, it's a loss of moral values, whereas others might say, oh, it's people are getting a better livelihood so they don't need a crutch of religion anymore. I'm not sure. Thoughts on Hegel? That's a broad question. That he is very, very hard to read. I think Hegel's fascinating and has a big influence on philosophy, particularly a lot of continental philosophies, and Marx himself, whose face we are drawing right here. Some of Hegel's dialectics are very interesting. His, I think, dialectic logic, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, all that kind of stuff, is fascinating and very interesting, and has had a big influence, but oh my goodness, do not try to read Hegel on your own. He's so, or do and accept it as a huge challenge, but whew. So if I were to say any thoughts on Hegel, it'd be complicated. Can philosophy tell something to someone who would like to commit suicide that might change his mind? That's an interesting question. I would say, just first off, for anyone out there that's listening that is contemplating suicide, I'd encourage you to talk to professionals. There's suicide help hotlines that are out there. I wouldn't want to, from a personal standpoint, be seen as actively encouraging that any more than I would want to be seen as actively encouraging any dogma. I would say, let me speak then from specifically the philosophy that I hold, which is skepticism, and the idea that what I think skepticism would say in the face of suicide is that you don't know, which can be a really sad thought for a lot of people, that, oh, there's nothing that I really know, that I lack some knowledge about the world, but it can also be a really calming or freeing thought. It can be the idea when the future looks really bleak, you don't know that the future is going to be that, and you don't really know anything. So I would say, from the skeptical position, the case against suicide, at least, or the thought about suicide would be that you don't know what the future is going to hold. You can't tell, and you can't be certain that any particular pain that you're going through is going to last for even another second, let alone for any longer. So that lack of knowledge and that humility within skepticism to say, I'm not sure what's going to happen next. And also, at least in my version of skepticism, the thirst for knowledge and the thirst for more information would be what I would bring against that. But like I said, anyone out there, I don't want to be held in any way accountable for anyone making choices such as that. But yeah, so that would be my thought on it in terms of where skepticism would come at it, that you don't know what the future is going to hold, so making such choices might be brash, but it's an interesting question, and a difficult one that philosophers have grappled with for quite a while. Oh, thoughts on phenomenology. I don't have as much of a background in continental philosophy. It's something I'd love to have more of a background in, but I can't speak sufficiently on phenomenology to want to go into it extemporaneously here. At some point, I'd love to do future videos and expand more on kind of the continental side of things, but the bulk of my work is in academic philosophy, so that's where I'm leaning. Doesn't pointing out paradoxes like the liar paradox only imply that the LEM is generally true unless in propositions where you run into paradox, hence it doesn't refute logic altogether. So the tough thing about logic is that you need the building blocks to really build it up. You really start with basic axioms and you have to build it up from there. If those axioms have cracks or issues with them, the whole structure often has the potential of falling down. I'll give some quick examples, but I'd suggest you check out some of my other videos on that. So something like the liar's revenge paradox is a particularly interesting issue here. So if we have a situation where, well, the law of the excluded middle doesn't apply to these propositions, so like this statement is false, maybe you would have a proposition that would say either this statement is false or the law of the excluded middle doesn't apply to this statement. Well, if the law of the excluded middle doesn't apply to that statement, then it's true, meaning the law of the excluded middle does apply to that statement. And so you'll get into these cycles of still not being able to designate particular statements as true or false. Now, you might say, well, maybe that means that logic's a useful tool, if not the bedrock for what makes things true and false. And I might say, okay, that's going to really weaken the power of logic. Sure, if we just use it as a useful tool to talk about things or as a foundation for computer science or something like that, it weakens the power of logic to say, wow, this argument, if those premises are true, that conclusion must be true, that power of deductive logic. So I would say it does throw some real issues in, especially with things in logic like the fact that if you, anything follows from a false statement. So if you throw a false statement out there, so if the LEM is false, even in one situation, anything follows from it, so literally all of your conclusions could be flawed. So those would be some of the issues there. Check out some of my videos on, I'm going to forget, the 100 Days of Logic has some good stuff on why anything follows from a false statement. Okay, let's keep going. As a skeptic, do you think there's a difference between the Booh-Yeh theory and moral relativism? Thanks. Yes, there's a bit of a difference there. Moral relativism is saying that, so they're both, I want to say non-cognitivist is the technical term, but I might be incorrect. Theories about morality, so basically saying that there's not some absolute good and evil out there. So the Booh-Yeh theory, or emotivism, basically says that when someone is saying something is good or bad, really what they're saying deep down is, I don't like this, or boo this, as opposed to, I like this, yay this, something's good. Whereas moral relativism has much more to do with culture. So you might say with moral relativism that someone is, their morality is simply the norms of their culture. So there does seem to be a difference there, basically, in that if you're saying the Booh-Yeh theory, the only way you can be wrong about that is if you're kind of wrong about your own mental states, in the way we were talking about Descartes earlier, of you can be, if you're saying this is wrong, the way that you could be incorrect about that would be by incorrectly analyzing your own mental states of saying that you dislike something when actually you like it. So that would be the way you could be wrong. Whereas with cultural relativism, you could be incorrect about that, or moral relativism, you could be incorrect about that by basically saying something against the norms of your society. So if you're in a society where everyone has to wear blue and it's deeply morally wrong to wear anything but blue, and you said, I think it's good to wear blue, then you would be incorrect, even if you were correct about your own mental states. So I think there's some differences there, but they're definitely more similar to each other than they are to kind of normative theories of ethics that state outright decisions that maximize pleasure are the good, or things that follow the categorical imperative are the good, or the things that the virtuous person would do are the good. So that would be where I'd parse that distinction. When do you think you'll do Aquinas' second way? Just no rush, just really looking forward to it. The answer is I don't know, as a good skeptic. I am really bad at finishing series, and I'm great at starting them, so who knows? But it's a series that I care about and I want to do well, so I want to take the time with some of them to do it, because I know as much as I know anything, and I don't know anything, so that doesn't help. But that there's a lot of people out there who will be very critical of it and who've thought a lot about this, so I want to be really specific when I'm doing them. But yes, soon, who knows, soon could mean anything. Depends on how bad the evil deceivers are lately. But yes, I appreciate the series. I really like the series. I want to keep doing it. But there's so many things I want to keep doing. And so many new things I want to keep starting. It's a serious problem. I have a question. What is the relationship between language and thinking? Can we think without a language? That's an interesting question. So there are some philosophers that have written on this. There's some philosophers that argue that animals can have knowledge, even though animals can't have language. So usually, in order to have something like knowledge, because that's what we talk about. Philosophers talk more about knowledge than thinking, because thinking might be tough to define. If you would say thinking is just activity going on in your brain, you might say, well, of course animals can think. Animals don't have language, so you can have thinking without language. But if you have things like knowledge, knowledge is generally defined as justified true belief, maybe plus some Gettier defier. And to get the belief part of that, you need a propositional attitude. So beliefs are propositional attitudes, a certain opinion that you have, a relation you have to a proposition or a statement. And to get a propositional attitude, you need to have propositions, and propositions to some degree require a language. So from that frame, you might say, well, maybe you can't have thinking, or at least knowledge, without language. There are some philosophers out there that would say, no, there are things that animals have that might be representational in the same way that propositions are, but lack language in the way that a dog or a cat can find its way home or associate noises with food and so on and so forth. So I'd say there's philosophers out there that would say that you can have thinking without language or knowledge without language. For me, I don't know. I'm a skeptic. I'm not sure. But it probably would depend on your definition of exactly what you mean by thinking and exactly what you mean by language, because if you think those kind of pictorial mental representations are kind of a language in the animal's head, then maybe you would say, well, actually, this is a language and that's what allows it to be a propositional statement, not, this is not a language, but it still can be a propositional statement. Or you might think that animals don't have knowledge at all. Or you might be a skeptic and think that no one has knowledge, or not think that anyone has knowledge. Oh, something about Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein should have taken that poker visit to Derrida. But a question, are you familiar with Lawrence Groland, and if so, do you have any comments on his iteration of socialism? I am not at all familiar with Lawrence Groland, but I will look them up after this video because that sounds fascinating. Thoughts on laws of nature, especially dispositionalism versus essentialism. Dispositionalism versus essentialism. Right off the bat, I don't have enough of a background in laws of nature to give you a quick quip on that, but it sounds like a fascinating thing to do, so look for a future video on that. Now, future being a broad term that can mean anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of years, but that sounds fascinating. The laws of nature, I'm not going to throw out an opinion off the cusp without doing a little bit of research. Is Nietzsche overrated, in my opinion? I think that Nietzsche is frequently misinterpreted, in my opinion. I think that people often take Nietzsche to mean a lot of things that Nietzsche didn't mean. And so I think there's often an issue with the use of Nietzsche to attempt to justify a particular position or something without a deeper understanding of it. So I would say misinterpreted more than overrated. I think Nietzsche did have interesting things to say. I think that often people don't understand what those things are, and so blow Nietzsche up to be something that he's not. So that would be my 2 cents to throw out there. What is philosophical knowledge as opposed to scientific knowledge? Ooh, fascinating question. So in philosophy, when we talk about knowledge, we talk about justified true belief, going back to Plato, and like I said, maybe something to deal with the Gettier problem, or warranted true belief if you want to be an externalist or something. But The interesting difference that you might, if you're going to make a distinction between philosophical knowledge and scientific knowledge, you might say that what scientists are talking about when they're talking about knowledge isn't what philosophers are talking about. It's more inductive, and it kind of ignores or glosses over some of the issues of the problem of induction. So that if we're talking about scientific knowledge in terms of the general scientific theories of a time or the standing theories, those are not this deep-seated, deductive, true for always and true forever knowledge like philosophical knowledge is looking for. They're theories that if new evidence came up tomorrow would change, and we would say that that's a good thing. Or if, a la Thomas Kuhn, our paradigm completely shifted, theories that we had thought we had discarded as false might end up being true, and theories that were previously true might end up being false. So a philosopher wouldn't call what scientific theories stand as knowledge. They would call it scientific theory, which has issues of the problem of underdetermination and the problem of induction, but also from an instrumentalist viewpoint, even if we can't know it for sure, it still may be the best tool for us to use, even if we're skeptical that it's perfectly true or solid. So that's where I would parse that distinction. And I think a lot of philosophers would shy away from calling standard scientific theories knowledge as much as just kind of what's out there, best guesses. How is skepticism related to pragmatism, or is it not? So depends on what you mean by pragmatism. If you're talking about pragmatism as in the theory of truth offered by James and C.S. Peirce, skepticism and pragmatism are in very serious conflict. If you're talking about another kind of pragmatism, I might not be sure what you mean, but if you're talking about that, I'd check out my video on pragmatism. It is half of the video is about a skeptic's objections to the kind of pragmatist viewpoint. Basically, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version here. Pragmatism says that if you don't have a reason to doubt something, you shouldn't doubt it. I, as a skeptic, am really concerned about that because I think that gives people the right or ability to dogmatically assert certain things in the face of other people saying, well, I don't have a reason to doubt this preconceived notion or pre-held belief that I have, so I'm going to hold it, come all, or come anything, and not someone else to say, well, I don't have a reason to doubt this thing, so I'm going to hold it no matter what. And there's no conversation those people can have that's based in logic because they both have different starting points. And so I think the only sensible place to start from is a view of skepticism and then to try to build knowledge from there. I'm skeptical that we can build knowledge from there, but I think that trying to start from dogmatically held presuppositions and then build to knowledge, you're only going to get disagreement and people yelling at each other, and you're not going to get rational argument because they each have a different premise that they're starting with. So that's some of my issues of pragmatism. Check out the video in my Truth series on what is pragmatism. The second half, I have way too many objections to it. I got really mad at William James and C.S. Peirce. All right. Is there some sort of language, neuroelectrical signals, for an example, for the brain in living creatures for thinking? So this is an interesting philosophy of mind question. For me, there's always the issue of philosophical zombies. So a philosophical zombie is basically the idea of someone that acts and walks and talks and even has brain signals just like someone that has phenomenological experience, so the actual experience of being a person, that experience of you being you, but the zombie doesn't have that experience but has all the hallmarks of that experience. And the idea is that you wouldn't be able to tell, there's no way to tell if someone actually is thinking in that way or has consciousness, or if they're a philosophical zombie from the outside. It's kind of the problem of other minds. So, to answer your question, it's really hard for us to map neurological signals onto consciousness because we don't have a way in the world to test for consciousness, because consciousness is inherently a first-person experience as opposed to something that's second-person. This is one of the reasons that scientists are often frustrated with this or have problems with this because there's no way to measure these ideas, but philosophers say just because you can't measure them doesn't mean they're not important. So That would be the distinction I'd go there. The application that I'm using is a very sophisticated application for the creation of Mark's face. It is the application known as Microsoft PowerPoint, real basic, nothing too fancy. Some people think that I make these faces through some computer program. Nope, it's just time and turning of little words. What are the best moral arguments for and against vegetarianism and veganism? Ooh, should we all go vegan? What do I personally think about it? So personally, I'm a skeptic, so I don't know. But I think that, so Peter Singer comes to mind when you're thinking about being an ethical vegan or an ethical vegetarian. I'd encourage you to read Peter Singer if you're interested in some of the arguments for vegetarianism or veganism for Peter Singer. Pain is pain, period. And animal pain is just as much pain as human pain, so we should care about animal pain as much, if not slightly less than human pain, and that you getting the pleasure of eating a particular meal might be far outweighed by the pain of a particular animal going through suffering. So that's arguments for it. Arguments against it might be something along the lines, well, you can make the argument around moral status, so you can say that I'm not sure animals have moral status for X, Y, Z reasons. Maybe animals don't have souls. Maybe you think animals don't have consciousness. Maybe you think that if we give animals consciousness, we have to give computers consciousness, and we're really uncomfortable doing that. So there's a range of those kinds of arguments against it. Another tack of arguments for vegetarianism or veganism goes along the lines of things like climate change and saying that it takes so much more energy to create meat than to create plant foods. We should focus on creating more plant food. That's going to hinge on your beliefs about climate change and your beliefs around that, whether or not you find that convincing. And that also is going to be a less stringent application. So that one isn't going to say, oh, you're causing horrible pain. It's going to say, eat 2 less meals with meat in a week. So those are some interesting arguments there. Personally, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of claims that other humans have consciousness, let alone that animals have consciousness or moral standing. So that would be where I would stand on it as a skeptic. At some point in the future, can you do some videos on the history of key philosophical terms or philosophers, please? At some point in the future, yes. What that point is always the difficulty. But yes, I'd love to do more on the history of philosophy and the history of some key terms. Just broadly, if anyone wants to donate on Patreon, I've been horrible about keeping up with it, so I'm sorry if anyone's donated and I haven't gotten back to them. My goal with that is to, if someone requests a video through Patreon and they donate $10 or more a month, I'll do that video frequently. Lately, I've been doing series of videos, which means that you get more bang for your buck, but it also means it takes longer for me to get to other videos. So right now, there's a series going on dealing with analytic, synthetic, necessary, contingent, a priori, a posteriori, distinctions in some of the places they fall apart. That was funded by someone. So if there's a specific term that you really care about or a specific philosophical figure you really care about, feel free to go ahead and donate on Patreon. I promise I'll do my best to get back to it. And it may take a while, but when it comes, I'll do my best to make it good. All right. First of all, I'm currently studying philosophy as a graduate student, and your channel offers, in my opinion, the clearest and most insightful comments on various topics. Thank you so much. My question is this. Open, then they wrote another comment, so we're going to jump down and we'll jump back up. Do you think that Kantian philosophy should be used more often in the discussion about the mental, the transcendental approach to cognition? To be fully honest, I am not as much of a fan of Kant as a lot of folks. I think that Kant has a lot of issues. I think that there's a lot of problems with the transcendental approach to cognition, and these things, I'm not going to get into all of those now. Things like transcendental arguments, I have some issues with. So I would say, unlike a lot of philosophers that are lying around these days, I'm not as much of a Kantian, so that's my perspective. But if you want some specific arguments on that, I have a video on Kant's transcendental arguments. He's featured prominently in my series on ethics, so you can look at some of that for my opinions on Kant. But Kantian philosophy, specifically a discussion about the mental, meh, is what I say to Kant. I'm sorry if that's a not satisfying answer to your question, but those are my feels. Any thoughts on people like Graham Priest who hold views like paraconsistent logic who try to deal with contradictions? So I think that it is fascinating to look into some kind of non-classical logics and paraconsistent logic and all those other things. One day, in the very, very distant future, because now we've started set theory, but the series after set theory, and like I said, that's a 6-month-long series, so take that with a grain of salt, is going to be a series on non-classical logics and all of that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for that, and we'll get into some of those things. Broadly, to answer your question, I think that a lot of logics have issues, and even dropping non-classical logic, I think it raises a number of other issues, but I think that those issues are underexplored broadly because a lot of people try to stick to classical logic and fix it instead of going outside of it and saying we need a new kind of logic. So I think there is a lot more work to be done on non-classical logics, and so go out there. All right, thoughts on psychoanalysis from an epistemological point of view. So, well, I'm a skeptic, like a hard skeptic, so anything I'm going to be skeptical of, and psychoanalysis is definitely up there in terms of the things to be skeptical of. So I would say I'm skeptical of it, but I can say that about anything. I don't know. So the question then comes, is it useful? So if you're an instrumentalist that doesn't strongly believe in the philosophical truth of a lot of scientific claims or practices, but you say, is science useful? There's a question around, can psychoanalysis be useful? I think that people find it useful, and there's some people that find it useful. But I don't know. I think to each their own. If you find it useful and you think that it's useful for you, it can be useful. If you don't find it useful, I'm skeptical of its truth value. So that'd be where I'd stand. Oh no, a bunch of comments just popped up. This is me struggling to use this device, as anyone that watched the first few minutes of the stream saw me sitting there and not being able to find any comments. Historically speaking, is it true that the distinction between ontology and epistemology was not really made before Kant? Whew. I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. I lack sufficient breadth of knowledge or breadth of experience. Well, I lack any knowledge. I'm a skeptic. But to say if anyone used that distinction or exactly how it evolved historically. And I think it's tough because just because those words weren't used, was there still some level of distinction made between them? I would lean towards I'm skeptical of that claim that it wasn't really used. It might not be used in the way that we use it in the modern world before Kant, but I'm not sure. Is thinking a tune a language? So many interesting questions. I don't know. How do you define a language would be the interesting question there. So once again, going back to our discussion of animals and whether or not animals can have knowledge and whether or not propositions can exist without a language or what really a language looks like. Music has rules and syntax and semantics in the way that a language does. So one might argue, well, it's a language. Music doesn't have the same representational nature as a language, and not that it isn't representational at all. I mean, particular songs or tunes or these kinds of things can feel representative of particular emotions or states of being, but it's not really representative in the same way that a language is, in that you have a word that might correspond to an object out in the world. So it depends on how you define a language. If you're saying a language is just a set of syntax, basically, rules that follow through, you're probably fine with thinking that music or thinking a tune is something like a language. If, on the other hand, you're going to hold that language is requisite of words having really deep kind of semantic properties of corresponding to things out in the world, you're going to get into some more trouble. So, I don't know. Depends on your definition of language. Is nationalism or globalism healthier for the soul? That's a broad question. I don't know. I think that I have no idea if souls exist or if they can even be healthy and how you would measure health of a soul. So that's a thought there. I think that at varying points in history, nationalism and globalism have risen. I think an economist would tell you that globalism is better broadly for the total amount of utility and things that exist in a system. And this is, so to step back for a second, this is one of the reasons we're doing Marx's face is we may be getting into some issues of philosophy of economics at some point in the future. It's interesting to see that economics, as many disciplines were, was built out of philosophy by people like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. And that this idea of maximizing the money that's in the system or maximizing utility comes from utilitarianism in a lot of ways. So if you believe in a lot of economic theories, they would probably say, oh, globalism is good because it is maximizing the total amount of utility in the system. And you might dispute that either on an empirical level of saying that it doesn't actually maximize utility, or on a different level of saying that, well, we might be, as economists would say, concerned about distribution. So concerned that maybe there's an issue of globalism, maybe there's more happiness in the whole system, but maybe it's accruing to the wrong people, or it's not accruing in an equal or healthy way. So that would be my thoughts on that. But healthy for the soul, whew, I don't know. I don't know what a soul is, and I don't know what makes it healthy. On the point of thinking, knowledge, and language, scientists often talk about them with respect to the notion of cognition. So if scientists are talking about it, it's probably measurable. Of course, the possession of cognition is what separates the modern from pre-modern humans. So this might be more appropriate than using animals as an example. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question around. So if scientists are talking about cognition in terms of something that can be studied, it's then distinct from consciousness, because consciousness inherently by definition is something that's a first-person experience. And a philosophical zombie could be a modern human, and so have cognition but lack consciousness. So that's part of the issue. It's interesting that you say that might be the case instead of animals. Those might be closer parallels in asking, can you have cognition and not have consciousness or not have language? It's an interesting question. I'm not 100% sure one way or the other, but it's an interesting thought. What are my thoughts on anarchy as political philosophy? I'm not sure. It probably would depend on how you define anarchy. I have a video on philosophical anarchy, and broadly the position that, if I can remember the content exactly, that there's not a sense of legitimacy given to the state in some ways, and it's basically just people taking from you. Anarchy in terms of political philosophy as this is what we should do. We should have anarchy. I mean, it depends on your underlying ethics. And this is why, for a lot of reasons, I have shied away from political philosophy in a lot of my videos, because I think you need to build up a basis of things like ethics in order to have a theory of justice. So you need to have a good sense of what's right and wrong before you can talk about what it's good and bad for a society to do. There's some way in which you need to get that individual level down first before you can build up to what's right and wrong for a society. So if you think that radical, absolute freedom for everyone, freedom defined in a very specific way, is good, then you might be in support of anarchy as a position. But it's an interesting question. Anarchy as opposed to the skeptical approach to anarchy. I don't know. All right. Am I a fan of Duluth's or anything postmodern? I think postmodernism is fascinating and very interesting, particularly because there are so many definitions of it, and it often defies definition. And depending on the field that you go into, it may mean very different things, because there are artistic traditions in postmodernism as well as kind of the philosophical groundwork for some of those traditions, and a piece of art can be called postmodern, as well as a skeptical position or a philosophical position, rather. Um, so I would say I think it's fascinating. I think it's a very interesting movement. Um, I think that I need to do more research into Duluth offer a cogent or coherent opinion on that, but I think postmodernism is fascinating, and has a lot of ties to skepticism in some ways, but and also is fascinating from an artistic point or an aesthetic point, looking at kind of postmodern traditions, from art to theater to all such things. So fascinating is what I would say of it. At some point we will definitely do videos on what is postmodernism and get deeper into that. But there are videos for another day. In your arguments for skepticism, you often refer to doubting ideas, but isn't doubt a properly basic mental intuition propositional attitude, whereas skepticism is a conclusion against assumptions? Okay, so let's make a couple distinctions here. First off, I'd throw you over to my series on In Defense of Skepticism, which goes into a lot of these issues in more depth, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version here. So, first off, I make a distinction between Pyrrhonian skepticism and academic skepticism. Despite the title of my channel being Carneades.org, and Carneades was a famous academic skeptic, the position that I hold specifically is Pyrrhonian skepticism. So the difference there is academic skeptics draw the conclusion that no one knows anything, whereas Pyrrhonian skeptics say, I don't know if anyone knows anything. I don't know anything. They withhold belief or withhold assent from any proposition. So isn't doubt a properly basic mental intuition or propositional attitude, whereas skepticism is a conclusion against assumption? So what I would say is doubt is a lack of something, which doesn't make it a separate thing necessarily. So let me frame it this way. Skeptics are averse to a particular propositional attitude. That's the propositional attitude of belief. That doesn't mean that skeptics don't have other propositional attitudes like hope, wonder. I can hope that something's true. I can wonder if it's true. I can posit it and test it as a hypothesis that it's true. And so I'm not deeply opposed to propositional attitudes. And so if doubt we classify as a propositional attitude, or I'd say maybe it's more of a lack of a propositional attitude. It's not the propositional attitude itself that I'm worried about. It's the specific one where you assent to something being true that I'm worried about. What are your thoughts on Kuhn's, that's Thomas Kuhn's, SOSR? Interesting. SOSR. I wonder what that stands for. Structure of scientific revolutions. The internet is a very helpful tool. So things like paradigm shift and structure of scientific revolutions, I think Kuhn is fascinating. I think that wonderful work has been done there. I think it's a shame that philosophy of science has often been separated from the actual work of science, and that there's not more scientists that are aware of Kuhn's work. So I'd say I'm a big fan of Kuhn, especially in that there's a lot of justification for issues around skepticism, like the problem of underdetermination in Kuhn's work, and the idea that if you have a particular scientific belief or a theory that is well justified by the evidence, if you have a paradigm shift of the background beliefs of your scientific method, that theory may become false suddenly or may stop being justified by the evidence. So I think Kuhn is fascinating. I would say SOSR, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is a great book to read. So that would be my thought. What happened to your micro? Hopefully I can still be heard. I assume people aren't just sticking around to watch me make marks. I have difficulties frequently with the quality of my audio. I apologize for that. It's a low budget production, let's say that. And if it bothers you, offer to send me a better microphone. Though I'm not sure if it's the quality of my microphone or the quality of the other software that I use that may be the issue. Did I read a news article about the man, Raphael Samuel, who's suing his parents for giving birth to him in the name of antinatalism? That's very interesting. The only reason that I read it is I saw a surprising uptick on my video, on views of my video on antinatalism. I was like, I wonder if this is in the news. Searched for it and saw this video. That's fascinating. Do I think that we could establish that as precedent and still live in a society? I think there might be some issues with that, just because a lot of people would have grounds to sue their parents. But I think it's a fascinating question. I think it's very interesting. As I say in a couple of my videos on antinatalism, I think there's a far better case for children who were never adopted suing literally every parent ever for choosing to have children instead of adopting them. Because wherever you stand on antinatalism, the intuition that's built up there should at the very least give you an intuition that there's some level of moral responsibility for people to adopt children instead of giving birth to children. So that's where I would stand on that, but check out my videos. I'm skeptical of antinatalism, but I definitely have read the article. And think it's very interesting that philosophical positions can come into the fore like this. Can I please address Greg Bosson's presuppositional apologetics? Oh, I started a series long ago, Better a Witty Fool, on presuppositionalism, but as you may see with many of my series, it has fallen by the wayside, but hopefully will be resurrected at some point soon. Hearing this live argument repeated more and more within the great debate community. Okay, yeah, presuppositionalism is an issue. I've done a number of videos on it in that series, but the series isn't done. So check out that series and stay tuned for more on that series one day. No, because language must be able to communicate something across, so thinking a tune. But, well, so someone says, oh, well, language must be able to communicate something across, so thinking a tune doesn't present a message or pass it on to someone else. Thinking a tune is just a store of data. I'm not sure. I think that I can hum a tune that makes you happy or makes you sad, or play a tune on a musical instrument that does those things. And in that way, I don't know. All right, unfortunately, we're getting near the end of the video as we see Marx's face is being completed. What we're going to do is we're going to take all of these lovely comments, and I'm going to do my best to reply to any other comments in the comments below. I think we have a couple more minutes on this video, so I'll respond as long as I can, and then when good old Marx is done over here, we'll call it a day, and I'll do my best to respond to it. Am I a vegan? If not, what's my argument against veganism? So first off, as a skeptic, I think that anyone that holds a position is the one that needs to justify their position. So I would say that someone that wants me to believe or act a certain way is the one that needs to justify it. So I don't think you need an argument against veganism. I think you need an argument for it. Maybe, but actions are more difficult than beliefs, because beliefs, there's a standard of lack of belief, and then you can build on top of that. Actions, you have to choose or not choose. You've got to eat, or you've got to die. Those are your choices. Like I said, I try to separate my personal life or personal choices from the work that I do on the channel. In terms of skepticism, I'm worried about arguments for veganism or vegetarianism that are based in Singer's philosophy because of issues around demonstrating animal consciousness and demonstrating that animals have pain or pleasure. Not from a scientific viewpoint of the synapses firing, but from the philosophical viewpoint of the first-person experience of consciousness. So that would be my concern there. I'm worried that if we give moral status to anything outside of humans, then things like computers should deserve moral status, and you shouldn't just be a vegan, you should never use technology because you're actually enslaving an entire race of beings. Because technology seems a lot smarter to me than animals do. Technology is able to do things like find out where you should go, draw maps of the entire world, publish giant videos. If you were to tell me to pick, does this iPhone have consciousness or does this ant have consciousness, I'm leaning towards the iPhone. And so I think because we can't deal with those distinctions, there's a certain level of issue there with some of those arguments. But you might have other arguments for veganism, which is why I think the person that's offering it should give the argument. So what's your argument for veganism would be my first thing, and then we can go from there. Wow, what a time to join the stream. Musical syntax has been quite philosophically interesting for me for a while now. Good. It's very fascinating is music a language? If it can convey feelings or emotions, is it a language? I don't know. It's fascinating. Depends on how you define a language, I suppose. I'm going to take PPE for A-level and hopefully at Uni 2. That sounds like a very, very British thing to say. I don't understand some of those abbreviations, but good for you. Good luck. Sure, we'll go with good luck. Theory of justice, Rawlsian confirmed. I would say Rawls has some interesting issues around particularly how Rawls deals with international issues as well as some of the issues around the epistemic states that people would need to be in order to really be behind the veil of ignorance and the conclusions that they would have to draw. I think we draw a lot of assumptions from, oh, this is what I would actually think because I have all this background knowledge, but in having that background knowledge, you might have some issues. I think that there's some issues around how a Rawlsian exactly would deal with things like equity. And Rawls said that we need to get rid of parents to ever have free equality of opportunity, which is another issue. So I think there's issues there. I think there's huge issues with Rawls's complete failure and refusal to deal with international development and international justice. So I think there's some fascinating things there. Would I consider myself a metaphysical naturalist? Do I think that nature is all that exists? So I would consider myself a skeptic, which means that I doubt everything. Or do I consider myself a supernaturalist, that things beyond nature exist? I'd say I don't know. I'd say that I could be skeptical of either position for different reasons on either side. So I'm not sure on that. I think that there's issues with either side. I think there's things that in our world that seem to be more than nature. But I think it's really confusing to say that. All right, well, Mark's going purple means that we're about done here. Like I said, I'm going to attempt to answer some of these comments. Oh, wow, some of the additional comments that have been added as I've been blathering on in the comments below. Let me see if I can copy this all so we don't lose it, or if someone else wants to copy it. Oh, no, I think I've got it. Okay, so thank you all so much for tuning in to this live Q&A stream, and thank you for all of your comments. Hopefully it was somewhat interesting for you to hear some of my opinions and thoughts on this stuff. We're going to head off right now, but thank you so much for helping us reach 40,000 subscribers. That's really cool. We're going to be continuing to do these videos into the future. If you really liked the live Q&A, say so in the comments below, and maybe we'll do more of them more frequently, building the faces of other philosophers. As always, watch this video and more. Thanks for all of your encouraging comments, and thanks for all your questions, and stay skeptical, everybody.